Awesome. Everyone, thank you all so much again for being here. So for our next panel, we are going to jump into the state of the Web3 stack. First thing we'll do is we'll ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, what they do, what their projects are. And then I'm going to provide a brief overview of what is the Web3 stack, why does it matter, and then we'll jump into some questions, and then we will have time for audience Q&A at the end. Apologies in the last panel, we just forgot logistically to stop for questions, but we will do questions this time. So with that, Jack, can you tell us what is SKALE? What do you do?
Hello, mic'd up. All right. Hi, I'm Jack O'Halloran, CEO of SKALE Labs. We are a layer 2 scalability network, so fully open, decentralized layer 2 scaling platform, initially building for Ethereum. So scalability is obviously a big issue. We think layer 2 is a phenomenal way to go solve that problem. Excited to share more of the details on how that works and how we're approaching the problem. I think there are many, many different approaches to layer 2 and scalability, and specifically around scaling smart contracts as opposed to just transactions. So that's what we do.
Hi, everyone. My name is Katherine Wu. I head of business development at Messari, which is a New York-based company that seeks to promote transparency in the crypto asset industry through mainly information gathering, and also sort of thinking around, what are sort of the minimal disclosure standards for token projects in the space.
Hi, I'm Tony Sheng. I lead product at Decentraland, which is a virtual world that's built on the Ethereum network. So as developers, you can buy land and create games or environments that users can experience as they traverse this open world that users actually own.
Yeah, Decentraland is almost kind of like The Sims or Second Life, right? But on Ethereum.
Yeah.
Awesome, guys. So for quick context, for those of you who don't know, when I talk about the Web3 stack, it's somewhat of a technical reference. Kind of a good analogy to think about is if you build applications for iOS or for Android, Google and Apple and those guys, they produce nice technical diagrams for developers outlining how does the operating system work. So typically at the bottom will be things like managing memory, making sure the CPU doesn't overheat, like a lot of very low-level functions. And as you go higher up the stack, you'll get to things like rendering the screen and actually drawing stuff on the screen, things like managing Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and maps and whatever. Some parts of that stack are required. Obviously, the system always needs to make sure that the CPU is not overheating, while other parts of it are optional, right? Like not all apps need a map function. And so all the APIs around the map are optional, and not all apps have to take advantage of them. So when we talk about the Web3 stack, what we're really referring to is this new kind of development stack where we have these base layer protocols, Bitcoin, Ethereum, EOS, Algorand, Affinity, whatever. These are kind of base layer foundations that provide global consensus among the state of the network, and then ways to build interesting applications on top of that. The cool thing about the Web3 stack in particular is that it allows consumers to be self-sovereign, both with regards to money or value, as well as to actually own their own data. And so when people in Bitcoin really talk about self-sovereign money, and if you kind of ask people about the Web3 vision generally, what they're really referring to is the idea that consumers can own their own data, and you don't have to have your data living on Facebook servers or on Google servers, but you can actually own your data. And so that's the Web3 stack. And so for today, we'll talk with Katherine, Jack, and Tony about where is the stack, what works today, what doesn't work, kind of where are things going. And so for that, guys, I'll just kick it off. You guys can all jump in. What do you think are the essential building blocks of the Web3 stack? How do you actually make a compelling application here?
Well, you start with the blockchain, and I think for us, we don't want to think too much about all the components. We just want to make something that users can use and work backwards from that. And core to Decentraland is that users own their property, their virtual land, or the items in the game. And so we start off with smart contracts on the Ethereum blockchain, and then everything else is just how do we actually get them to interact with this app, interact with the contract. So if you write a smart contract, a user can run their own node and interact with the contract directly, but most users aren't going to do that. So you need to find a way to get from the state that's stored on the Ethereum blockchain all the way up to a user walking around a virtual world. And so that's been actually pretty challenging from the beginning since we didn't have a lot of tooling for developers. We didn't have a lot of services that we could use the same way that you would build like a Web2 app. There are lots of services, lots of APIs, lots of documentation. So just to give you a quick example, if you're a developer that wants to put something on their land in Decentraland, you buy the land on a marketplace. That marketplace is a website that uses like MetaMask or some other kind of extension that allows you to have a wallet. And by the way, you need to figure out how to get Ethereum and then convert that to Mana and then interact with the smart contract that we're exposing in the web. And then once you have that, then you're able to deploy scenes to the land. And that's using open web technologies that aren't actually blockchain things. It's like WebVR, Babylon.js, similar to A-Frame, if any of you are familiar with that. You can create these 3D worlds. And then to store that content, we create an SDK that allows you to view your scene and then store it on IPFS, which is a distributed storage protocol. And we point to it using IPNS. And then we roll that all up into an engine that we had to build custom so that when you walk around, everything loads. So it's very tedious when you're creating an app or an experience that doesn't have a lot of prior art. So I guess that's what I'm seeing now is that a lot of things that we had to build from scratch are now starting to become services. So before we couldn't query data, we're now working with the graph to figure out how to use their service to query data. Luckily, we had IPFS and IPNS to store our content, but I think that experience is going to get better over time too. And like dev tooling has advanced by like a light year over the last year.
Yeah, and speaking of like building blocks, I personally think about it as like two things, right? There's like, do you work on the killer app or do you work on like the building blocks or like the infrastructure stuff? And so the example of like Decentraland is sort of like a killer app, right? It's an NFT, it's like CryptoKitties, it's fun, people relate to that easy. So do you focus on that and then build infrastructure around it, or do you first have all that ready? And I think they go hand in hand. And we can talk about this later, but like something that I think about a lot is like, okay, in order for this entire thing to flourish, you have to build out an ecosystem in a really responsible, healthy way that will make it sustainable.
Yeah. So, yeah, great answer. So to add to that, I have the opportunity to speak to developers pretty much every day. We have an infrastructure product or network, and so I'm speaking with the Tonys of the world that are building applications, building decentralized games, enterprise projects, consumer internet disruptors, et cetera. And what I'm finding is the core right now is incredibly strong, and I try to think of it as, hey, put yourself in the shoes of the entrepreneur creating a decentralized application. And you have to think about, there's pieces that are core when it comes to decentralization and the Web3 stack that you just cannot give on. And that's how does money get into the system? How do you validate identity? And then how do you run consensus and how do you execute smart contracts? So those are the core pieces that just unyielding, no one gives up on. And seeing a lot of strength there, a lot of maturity with these projects. Layer 2, I think, is a piece that's now really becoming a piece of the equation for, well, obviously every project I'm talking to. But then there's this auxiliary components that I think are really incredibly exciting. And I'm seeing people start in this almost like Web 2.5 zone where they handle the things that are core to decentralization. They get a foothold, and then they grow outward, and they start. Next thing you know, they have, they're using a decentralized storage, right? And maybe they're using something for oracles, but they have to start where it matters most, and that's money and transactions.
One thing that's really interesting, all three of you kind of alluded to this, is right, like a year ago, very little infrastructure existed, and especially guys like Tony and Katherine, you guys are trying to build end-user applications of forms, and you realized like none of the tooling was there, and you've either invented a lot of it your own or kind of built some hacky things. And you kind of alluded like a lot of those things are becoming service products basically, and that's like kind of accelerating. I think Jack, how you and Stan got started is kind of you guys realized the same thing. Curious, do you guys have any other thoughts on like this dynamic between like the application people try and push it forward, they hit some roadblocks, and then the infrastructure catches up, right? I don't know. Do you guys have any deeper thoughts there?
So when I met my co-founder, Stan, our CTO, he actually was trying to build infrastructure that could solve a problem for the world's dominant decentralized exchange. And so he was thinking, what how do you solve scalability? And he also had ideas, well, we could have this Twitter payments application, and how can we help the whole world push transactions forward? And so he was coming at this from the premise of, I'm building the dApp. And so I met him, and I've been in 13 years of enterprise software, infrastructure, middleware, and we kind of came together. We said, wow, let's build this for everyone else. And yeah, so that kind of, I think that those needs drive innovation.
So what you said earlier reminds me a little bit of this tension that we're seeing between technology and law, right? And this is something I think about a lot given my own background, but it's sort of like, and it's not a new concept. This is not like a Web3 like debate, right? This has always been around. Like in 1995, Wei Dai, who wrote, he's like the predecessor of like Bitcoin. He wrote the B-money thing. But anyway, so he posed the question, which is, okay, as developers, is it better to spend my resources building technology that's so powerful and dedicate all my resources to it, or do I spend time like lobbying or convincing governments not to control us? And he kind of put it that way, right? And then his conclusion was that, like, you know what, it's better to focus on building this tech out until it's so strong and so mature that like governments can't stop it. And from my viewpoint, which is that I think it's a little bit like, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And I think it's also just sort of like, at the end of the day, like, Web3 is about decentralization, it's about community governance. But at the end of the day, when shit hits the fan, people look to regulators and they look to laws to help them, right? It's the same idea as like, like I'm a teenager and my parents are like, oh, we're gonna be out for an evening. And I'm like, yes, no parents, every day's a weekend, right? Like, and I'm like, I can do whatever I want with my siblings. But you know what? As soon as my siblings does something that annoys me, I'm like, you know what? I'm telling mom and dad. And I think that's like that debate, like you just really can't win. So, when you're thinking about, do I build tech or do I like circumvent laws, I don't think it should be like sort of mutually exclusive. And we do see a lot of tools, like you said earlier, Kyle, like service providers that have sort of, compliance in the name of the game, right? So if you look at Chainalysis or TokenSoft or CoinList, like these are all examples of companies that are sort of like looking to, I think, bridge that a little bit.
All right, so next question's for you. So you focus on a lot on consumer applications and gaming. What's working, what's not? I think Decentraland released kind of an updated marketplace a few days ago, right? Like, can you tell us what's working today? There's a few games that have been successful.
Yeah, I think what's worked well are games that have the benefits of blockchain baked into it, rather than trying to create something that's already popular outside of Web3 and adding a coin to it. So I think some of the games you might be alluding to are FOMO 3D, which is branded as a transparent Ponzi scheme or something. Has done really well. And actually, I don't view that very negatively, actually, because it's just these economic constructs that people are playing around with, and they tend to work really well with smart contracts. It doesn't have a lot of graphical needs.
Tony, could you describe for people like what is FOMO 3D?
Okay, sure. So the way FOMO 3D works is there's this concept of keys, and the keys increase in price as each one gets bought along a bonding curve, so it goes kind of like this. First price is close to 0, and then over time it gets higher and higher and higher. And there's this concept of a round. So it starts out, I think, 24 hours, and every time a key is bought, the timer extends for 30 seconds, I think. So as long as people keep buying keys, the round continues until it gets so expensive that nobody can afford to buy it. And at that point, the person who bought the last key wins the entire jackpot. Well, not the entire jackpot. They win a portion of the jackpot. The rest is distributed in these interesting ways that probably isn't worth getting into. And so this is very simple, right? It's like a relatively straightforward smart contract, relatively straightforward user interface. And then the last jackpot was in the millions of dollars. I forget exactly how much.
I think the guy won like $10 million.
Yeah, it was a lot.
Yeah.
And the way somebody won was they actually spammed the Ethereum network, filled an entire block with empty transactions. I think it cost like at least tens of thousands of dollars, maybe more. But they walked away with millions of dollars. And I don't think this is like the end state. This isn't what we're all sitting here like excited to build. But I do think that this is a good starting point. It doesn't have a lot of dependencies. It doesn't need a lot of these primitives that teams like ours are inventing to try to get this more complex thing up. So that's working really well. Other things that are working well are, well, I mean, that's working really well. We've seen a lot of success in our marketplace as well, but that's pretty similar to a very basic smart contract thing. We have like millions of dollars of transaction volume in land every month. Most recently, some land was sold for $100,000, made some news. But that's also not what I care about. What I want is people having a great time in this open virtual world where they own all of their stuff and there's more freedom and liberty and you can experiment with all these things. And that's getting more and more achievable the more services become available to us. And we don't have to build it. So every time we have to build something from scratch, like for example, when we first did our land auction, we built state channels. This is like back in December. We hacked together a version of state channels. And now Amin and Connext, and they're coming out with their own version of state channels. They just got a big grant from the Ethereum Foundation to do this. And that'll be open source. So the next Decentraland, don't compete with us, will come out and they'll be able to just use this. I think this trend is very positive. We're going to start to be able to make buy decisions rather than build decisions, and that's going to accelerate development in this consumer Web3 application space.
Katherine, can you let us know what's kind of the state of the Web3 stack with regards to TCRs? Messari has some very interesting token mechanics and how the system works. You guys, I think, have built some stuff and maybe using some outside stuff. Can you walk us through what's working specifically for the Messari?
Yeah, sure. And it's probably better to frame it in a little bit more relatable way. So kind of the mantra in the tech space, not just crypto, but tech in general, is move fast and break things, right? And I get that. But when you're moving fast and you're breaking things, and the things that you're breaking are laws, and you think about the people who are hurting from that, and in this case, especially in ICOs, that's retail investors. I think it's necessary to step back a little bit and ask why and is it worth it. And one parallel that I've heard from people is, well, look at Uber. They moved fast, they broke things, and now we have ride-sharing apps. But I would argue and say, honestly, breaking taxi licensing laws and straight up scamming retail investors are two very different things. So that's kind of the view that I take, which is that, let's bring it back to the traditional space, which is that if you're a public company, or you want to go public, you have to file all these disclosure statements, and that's why you're able to raise money from retail investors, right? Because you have all the risk factors written out, you have all your financials, they're all very transparent, and generally issuers do have an idea of how to best structure something so that it is it's fair and people get all that information. But when you bring it into the token space and you look at it, you're like, okay, all of these projects, and maybe less so this year, but in 2017 definitely, they're raising $10, $20 million off of a white paper that was probably plagiarized, right? You go on these ICO websites, and under advisors, you see a picture of Ryan Gosling, which that shouldn't be right. I'm sure he's a talented man, but he's probably not an ICO advisor. But so it's how are you raising so much money? And I just think that's a little bit irresponsible. I love the idea of crowdfunding and making it super accessible, but it's a little bit irresponsible, I think, when you're sort of when you're not giving enough information. People just generally make better decisions with more information. So with specifically on Messari, we're thinking, we're taking tokens as an asset class, and we're saying, there's some stuff, for example, in an S1 registration statement that probably wouldn't apply to this sort of asset class, and there are different competing priorities and things that people should know. Easy example, and I think people who are entrenched in the industry all understand what I say when I say, your future diluted supply. I know what it means. I think people on this panel know what it means, but probably retail don't. And so that really ultimately screws the retail investors over. So I think me and along with the entire team, I think we're just a bunch of information or data maximalists, right? If you have more information, that's good. So we spent a lot of time thinking about how to incentivize projects to disclose these information that we think is important for fundraising, especially in this token sort of new asset class.
So so for you guys and Katherine specifically, you guys have built some TCR stuff. Kind of technically, what's working thus far for you guys? What are the challenges?
Yeah, well, the challenges, with any company that's trying to decentralize, how do you do that? And we haven't really seen good examples of companies who are doing that. We see a lot of roadmaps, we see a lot of things being talked about, but it's if you want token holders, right, all your community to govern something, that's just, I mean, just thinking about all of that is really hard. The attack vectors, like the off-chain stuff. What if two people get together like offline and collude and do that? I mean, we're basically solving, I mean, when we think about token governance, we're solving fundamental like human behavior, and that's really tough. And that's a challenge, I think, not just for us, but for any company that's thinking about decentralizing in the long run.
Got to deal with people? Is that the problem?
Like humans are shitty.
All right, Jack. Next one's for you. So, what kind of apps are being built on SKALE today? I think you guys have an innovator program or something, and there's 5 or 10 groups. I don't think you can name any names, but can you talk to us? What kind of applications today are being built on SKALE?
Yeah, so we are launching with a cohort of roughly 10 companies with the mainnet launch early in Q1 next year, and we've had just an overwhelming abundance of applications for this program. So it's a white glove program. We give these projects support. We help them with security audits, engineering resources. And the thing is, about half the companies and projects and organizations I speak with have their own internal infrastructure teams. And not because they want to, it's just they feel like they have to solve this problem. And so I think we're about ready to release probably 20% of the engineering resources on the dApp side so they can actually work on core product. So anyways, back to your question, of these companies we're working with, they range from gaming's an incredibly active space, and I think gaming is driving a lot of innovation. I come from the enterprise, 13 years of enterprise software experience, hadn't worked in gaming, and I'm amazed to see what's happening there from a technical perspective. But we work with projects and companies and even major governmental organizations that are launching solar projects, for example, and tokenizing smart grid distribution of energy and incentivizing humans to use solar and be more active in the environment and make it financially rewarding. So a whole gamut of between those two, of governments to gaming, and in the middle we've got enterprise disruptors where they're leveraging tokens to create network effects and areas like recruiting and hiring, et cetera. And then in the consumer, there are a lot of consumer internet disruptors as well. People are going, name a top 10 consumer internet company, and there are 10 really amazing teams going after them. And right now we're in this place where they're just lacking infrastructure, and they're driving us, we're supporting them, and I think we're going to see some really exciting stuff this summer.
Yeah, so you guys, your innovators program is kind of starting now, and I think you guys are rolling out in Q1. Is that correct?
That's correct. So and by the way, we had a lot of applications, and thank you for your blog posts and tweets, Kyle. We had a lot more after that. So
thank you guys for building software. We got to scale these things. Okay, so all three of you guys, you feel free to weigh in on this one. As the Web3 stack kind of matures, we're starting to see it get easier to build things. What are some new behaviors you think might kind of come out that are maybe non-intuitive today? Like what are any second order effects you think are, could happen that aren't clear today?
I don't know if I'd characterize them as second order effects per se, but I think maybe I'll take a step back, and my perspective on Web3 is that it's kind of a platonic ideal that doesn't really mean anything specifically. It's kind of this vision of kind of how you just introduced it, Kyle. It's this more permissionless, more open, less reliant on trust, takes power away from the internet monopolists and gives it to the users. How that actually manifests is pretty unknown. Like we actually don't have the infrastructure yet for every person to own all of their data and then lease it out to apps. That's actually quite far away. I don't even know if we're going to have that. There are people working on it, but I don't know if that's really key. What is true about Web3, or at least what we're seeing empirically around Web3, is that rather than have state stored in a server, like Google's campus or their data centers, it's on a blockchain where multiple people validate that state, and so nobody can go in and change it. And so if you think of the client-server model of today's web, where when I query something in Google, my client is the web browser. I say, where's the Multicoin conference? Then I send that input to Google. They process it, send it back. And where they process it and manage the state and everything is the server. So what's I don't necessarily think that things changed that much other than that shift of power. Now what you can actually have is less reliance on trust of the state of these systems. And the obvious things that are important are like property and money. And so if there's anything really new and really exciting, it's that things like virtual land couldn't have been possible before, because you wouldn't really value something that is stored in some game company's server as much as something that is validated by a whole network. So I guess my answer is that you might see these like much bigger economies emerge on the internet that are native to the internet that we wouldn't trust to form before.
I'll wait. I'll throw an example. So one thing that I've thought about a lot is social media and blockchain. One of the like platonic ideals of crypto is, instead of you've got Facebook and Snapchat and Twitter and Instagram, whatever. The idea of like basically you have a public key online, right? Is you make entries to any kind of social application. You kind of publish that on a blockchain. In order to only kind of manage you'd still be able to control who your friends are and stuff. And then you'd be able to have like this single I call it the social stream, and you'd be able to have any application on top of that views data in different ways. It allows for kind of interesting interactions and dynamics. I've always thought that if we could get there, how do you pay for this all? And like, I don't know about you guys, but I really hate Facebook ads. I pay for YouTube so that I don't have to get YouTube ads. But on Facebook today, you actually don't have the right to opt out of ads. It's actually impossible. And so it's like very narrow thinking, but I think there'll be some second order ways to think about this over time, is if you actually control your own data and control the experience, you'll be able to, for something that's like a shared commons, actually, instead of being forced to be advertised to, you could actually pay, probably like the network operators to actually opt out of advertising entirely. And I think that's a very interesting implication that today is basically unheard of.
Yeah, and so just to add to that, so this is a topic that I look around the room and everybody here is pretty dialed into crypto and disruption, but we're all wondering when this is going to happen. And my feeling is it's going to be, this is a 3-year overnight success. We're waiting, and all of a sudden, when this stuff hits, it's exponential. And so I see entrepreneurs going after use cases that we all know and understand, we can get our hands around, where it's really clear and obvious, like for example, taking ads out of YouTube and giving that data and empowering users and giving profit sharing and governance back to the group. That's a powerful tool as an entrepreneur. So I think that's going to hit, and it's going to feel like it's taking forever, and all of a sudden it happens fast, and then we're going to find use cases we don't even know of, we're not envisioning, and that's where I think this stuff gets really transformational.
Yeah, I think these are all good points. One point that I would not push back, but just like pose as like and I don't have a solution to this, but it's, we all understand, okay, Web2 led to all these like tech giants, they own your data, blah, blah, blah. Web3, you have the choice to own your data, that's great. But I think in the short, medium, or maybe in like 5-10 years, I think the world might see this sort of like competing dual information system layer, which one hand you have this like Western ideal of everyone is in control and everyone like, has their data and everyone has a say in all this. But then you also have, and I think that's sort of a very Western bubble way of thinking. And I don't know if that would necessarily translate globally across cultures. And just, I don't have a data point in the Web3 world to point it to, but let's just look at Web2, right? And it's like, okay, Facebook has its benefits, a lot of it, but it was also conceived in the US, in the Western world. And where they did not foresee is, for example, state actors using it maliciously. That's just not something that like people here even thought about, doing. And so I think an important consideration, I'm very excited about the prospects, is also thinking about, okay, the tech. And that's why there's all these issues coming up with like tech and ethics and whatever, but it's like things we have to think outside of our bubble for. And yeah, I don't have a solution, but it's just something I've been pondering.
Our last question for our panelists, for me, and then we'll open it up for Q&A after this. As you guys are building your products, what's been one service you've seen that a year ago was basically broken and you had to build it by hand, that today you can actually rely on a third-party abstraction? Jack, you can't say SKALE. That's too easy.
There are a few. One that's pretty obvious that a lot of people use is like Web3 wallet interfaces. which might be a cop-out because a year ago nobody was really building Ethereum smart contract. I mean, some people were, but we take it for granted, though. It's like it allows users to interact with the blockchain in a somewhat similar way to how they use normal apps now. And without it, none of these web-based apps actually work. Another that's starting to take shape is second layer 2 scalability solutions, whether that's state channels or some kind of Plasma implementation like what SKALE is working on. It seems like that's about to happen, and that's going to be pretty important. We actually have contributed to some Plasma research ourselves and feel very optimistic about this, like meaningfully improving the scalability of decentralized applications. And then I guess like just not even just blockchain services, but open source stuff has been critical to building. Like IPFS, that's not really a blockchain project per se, but without it, we wouldn't be able to store anything. So that all this open work is what makes these things possible, and true of Web 2 as well. Like all open source contributions is really power the internet. So yeah, very, very grateful for all of the free information and constructs that we're able to use.
Yeah, actually building on that point, I think even a year ago, when you're Googling anything in this space, you almost had to write the content that you were Googling because there just wasn't anything out there. But just in the past year, like with so many like people coming into the space and just like how willing people are, sharing their knowledge or whatever, I think there's been an kind of like increasing emphasis being placed on how do we bring more people into the space, get them to understand it, and as a result, we're getting more just like really awesome content and knowledge sharing.
Yeah, so I'm seeing this kind of general theme across a lot of these categories where we are creating tools to displace the need for a cryptographer being on a team. So this industry will never scale if a team of 3 people who are launching a dApp need somebody who's a cryptographer on the team. So there are actually people creating power user tools to make it plug and play to build smart contracts that you cannot screw up. And it's not for an end user in marketing dialing up a smart contract. No, this is a power user. It's an engineer. It's somebody who really knows how to interface with systems. But that person's not a cryptographer, and they shouldn't need to be. So I'm seeing these in the Oracle arena, in smart contract arena, and just seeing things that make this. It's also accessibility. You need to make these tools accessible to your normal entrepreneurs and business leaders and engineering directors and analysts and operations people.
Awesome, guys. Well, thank you, panelists. We'll open it up for some Q&A. Matt, I think we got first questions, hopefully.
Yep. So, guys, if you feel free to submit questions via Telegram, too. I'll start off. It sounds like there's been a real rise in sort of modular tooling that you guys can plug into on the back end. I'm curious, a year ago, how much time were you allocating and spending to infrastructure versus product? What does that time allocation look like today, and how do you see that moving forward?
It was basically all infrastructure for a long time. And the only products we had were very simple front-end interfaces to like buy a parcel of land, for example. And it hasn't really been until maybe this quarter where we've started to focus more than half of our engineering resources on actual end user kind of client experiences. So part of that is tooling, part of that is just the path dependence of creating something like what we're trying to build. But yeah, I mean, I think the ratio of building infrastructure that should be publicly available or usable by lots of different teams, hopefully teams have to spend less time on that soon, and that's kind of what we're seeing.
Well, so a year ago, Messari didn't exist, so that's so I'll just answer it from like a very macro sort of my own observation. But I think in the past year, what we've seen first we've seen the breakout of like NFTs, right? Not to beat a dead horse, but like CryptoKitties. But also through that, I think it highlighted a lot of problems that exist with current like protocols and just scaling issues and all that. So I actually, from my perspective, in the last year, we've seen an explosion of a lot of like protocols popping up. I mean, they've existed before, but especially like I feel like this year, all I've heard about is like, oh, this protocol is building a better Ethereum, or they're building a better whatever. And so we're seeing these like competing protocols, and I think what this might lead to in the future is, I think there might be a future with competing protocols, and we're just sort of seeing that play out. And that's a very big sort of like infrastructure play that will allow for the development of many other things.
Yeah. Next question. Yeah, Telegram or Mike. We can do kind of either one. I think next Mike's coming around.
Just like speaking about ownership for a minute through the eyes of the consumer, because that's really central of a tenet here if we're going to be walking around with our own data. But how do you reconcile that with sort of innovations that are coming at it from a different perspective, like federated machine learning, where the idea of ownership is actually my data is maybe on my device, and that feels like something I can wrap my head around as an individual. Do you see that as being sort of like an orthogonal stream, or do these things reconcile somewhere? Because ownership is a really kind of fuzzy concept, right?
I'm seeing even similar models come up in life science and genetics research and drug development, and I think federating ownership can be an incredibly sophisticated and complex a thing, and in environments that we're not necessarily thinking of. It's not necessarily just the user. It's building models that impact all sorts of industries, from healthcare to insurance, life science, and particularly in, I think, IP drug development, we're going to see some cool stuff. So,
I think to that end, Andrew. So I think kind of so Google kind of is like the kind of king of AI today, and like Google basically owns all of your data. Apple, starting a few years ago, started talking about, I think they call it differential privacy, and it's kind of the idea of you keep your data on your phone, and you can kind of run machine learning models, and the cloud gets like anonymized models, but you don't actually send your data to the cloud. So I know Apple's really been pioneering a lot of the research here. In crypto today, we're seeing a number of teams kind of extend these ideas around data sharing. So like things like Ocean Protocol and Computable. One of our investors, I don't think he's here, his name is Brett Hurt. He runs a company called Data World. They do a lot of federated data stuff, but no crypto yet. I think in the next few years, you're going to see these things really converge. I think a lot of the work Apple's done is going to be a big effort here. And Google has more recently started to talk about federated AI as well. So I expect these things to hit pretty hard. Oasis and Ocean are the two biggest teams I can think of in crypto that are in that world today.
So we have a question on Telegram from Frank. What is most missing in terms of tooling to speed up the development of Web3?
SKALE?
I'm obviously biased towards layer 2 solutions, but let's ask.
I would say on-ramps, ways to get users into the system. Right now, the TAM of dApp users is pretty low. And part of that is because there aren't killer apps out there yet. Some of them aren't really designed to be massive in terms of user base. But a lot of it is just, even if somebody would play, like say, some toy game that I made, it's hard to get them. I think it's like 20 steps to get Ethereum in and like them actually using it in the web browser. So there's the basic UX that a lot of people are working on improving. And then there's the legal and regulatory compliance that you need to overcome in order to accept fiat from a user and have them start working with your dApp.
Next question is here.
Yes. Hi, I got a question about layer 2 solutions. For like Tony, when you think about picking a partner, what do you think are the key requirements? And the question for Jack is, there are a number of layer 2 solutions. What do you think are the key aspects, and why
Good question.
Yeah, I think at this stage, with such experimental, like new technology, it usually requires a team, if there's anything at stake, to actually have themselves a pretty strong understanding of how that technology works. So the first stage is like understanding how, say, Plasma works, and specifically how SKALE's Plasma works, because they're all a little bit different, and then forming a perspective on like which technical implementation is actually the best fit for your team. And then it's the same kind of like considerations you would have for choosing like a cloud database provider or something. Like, do I trust this team? Do they have a good reputation? Do I know people that have used it? Is the price good? Like, does business model work with us? Things like that. But that kind of vendor selection is going to be a lot easier in a few years once there are more data points of people having either success or failures on these platforms. But today it's really just like agreeing with the technology and thinking it's a good fit, and then feeling good about the team that you're going to be working with, because there are going to be a lot of bugs and new things that you have to like chop through the forest together.
Yeah, so I think the obvious answers that people like to talk about are one, speed. How fast is it? The other piece is it performant? Can it execute smart contracts, or am I limited to just doing transactions? And then the third piece that's pretty obvious is just security, right? It's got to be secure. But I think some less talked about differentiating factors are, one is, how easy is it to just set this thing up and manage it, right? You've got other stuff to do, right? You're building a complex system, a complex application, or whatever it might be. So there is an element of, and look at Stripe, look at Twilio, why were they so successful? So that was a big piece of it. The other piece is just cost effectiveness, and that's not well talked about. So doing 2 transactions per second, that doesn't seem like huge scale, but let me tell you, that's $1 million a month on Ethereum. So it's got to be cost effective as well. So all of these things come together, and at the end of the day, it's one experience. And the interesting thing, we're in an open source world. So if SKALE's version of consensus isn't the best one, maybe we start using something else. If ours is, our competitors start using us. So who puts together the best experience, executes, fixes bugs, has great relationships with their customers or partners, and those are the pieces I think that will help define the winner.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you just want like a button to press. Okay? Like when I spin up something on Amazon, I just trust that AWS is going to work. Like that's what a developer wants with a scaling solution.
And that goes to like why design is so important. Like even now, like when I use new products, I always brace myself for being confused for at least like a couple hours. Probably telegram like 50 people to ask them about, how do I use a product? Is this thing lost? Oh my God, are my keys? Like there's so many issues just from like a design and user experience perspective that, I think we have a long way to go, but I do think it's good that people are thinking about it.
Yeah. Next question, Telegram or Mike?
So my question is, if you were to put a time frame on the release of, or where frameworks that would be in the blockchain space more comprehensive, like Angular or Ember, or a full framework for app development where the stack level protocols are no longer where the development focus is, and there's competing deployment dApp models that already have it. How far away is that? Is that a 3 or 5, or how many years until we have complete dApp development stacks that can just roll an app as simple as rolling a web app today?
I think it's depends on your requirements for your app. Because if you have a certain set of requirements that already exists with Truffle, and you just use like React or Angular or whatever you use for the web stuff, and you hook it into the Web3 functions, and you have a functioning web app. But what you wouldn't have is if, for example, you needed like some amount of throughput, you would need some other thing. If you wanted privacy, that's not really possible yet. If you wanted identity, that's has some certain requirements. Like if it's like really self-sovereign identity, like that doesn't really exist yet. So there are a lot of things that we take for granted with Web 2 development, like OAuth and all these other things that are actually services that you plug into from the framework that don't exist yet. So I wouldn't say the framework is missing necessarily. It's that the services are missing. So we'll have we already have a framework. That's what almost everybody uses for dApp development. But like a lot of the primitives don't exist yet. You have to either use Web 2 versions of it or roll it yourself.